Stephen Harper is meeting with First Nations leaders this afternoon. Joining us to discuss, we are joined by Jeffrey Rath. He's a lawyer at Rath & Company and is representing a number of chiefs at today's meeting with Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He has practiced treaty law on behalf of the First Nations community in Alberta and at every level of the Canadian court system. And he believes that Ottawa owes First Nations billions of dollars in treaty settlements. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Jeffrey.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, thank you. Well, let's get to focus on the meetings today, because it seems like, at least right now, they sort of hang in the balance with some First Nations chiefs saying that they will not attend. Sean Atleo, I believe, is attending. Can you give us some insight into where the meetings stand right now?
My sense is that the meetings will likely go ahead today. The long and the short of it is what the chiefs are saying is that they want to be treated with respect, and they certainly want the Queen's representative, the Governor-General of Canada, to take part in these meetings.
Jeffrey, I don't know if you were able to hear much of our interview before with Calvin Haleen, but you know there are a number of different people, a number of different voices. There's a whole spectrum of opinion. He's strongly of the view that Native communities need more autonomy, more self-sufficiency, more responsibility. What is it? You know, you're an advocate and have worked in the legal field on this. What is it that the federal government needs to do to improve the situation for Native communities in Canada?
Well, I'd like to start with the Government of Canada paying First Nations people the billions that they're owed under treaty. I mean, I have clients, that are owed over $500 million in treaty benefits, which would go a long way towards alleviating the poverty in those communities if that money was simply provided to them as required and put into trust to provide an endowment for these communities so that they could be self-sufficient and reliant and take care of themselves without the interference of Indian Affairs bureaucrats at every turn.
Leaving the money that is owed aside, they have received a number. Critics would argue that they have already received billions, and it's the way that they are structurally allocated that has led to these kind of problems that we are seeing. What would you say to the criticism that money itself is not going to solve this issue?
Well, I mean, the reality of it is money solves poverty. Accountability doesn't solve poverty. It's the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office that needs to be accountable for the current dysfunction of the system. But the answer isn't to take the poorest people in the country and say, we're going to give you less money, or simply say, you need to be accountable, and that's going to solve all of your problems. You know, Calvin Haleen's whole approach to, Indians need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and be more self-reliant, and let's take away a hugely important economic development tool, which, say what you want about the Indian Act. There are certainly aspects of it that are very positive for First Nations people, including the Indian Act tax exemption, which, if used properly, is a huge tool for economic growth for First Nations, being able to create tax-free businesses on reserve. So, for someone like Mr. Haleen, who does quite well for himself, to suggest that poor people across the country should have important economic development tools taken away from them, and to not be paid what they're owed under treaty in the billions of dollars, and continue to live in abject poverty with the only option of, quote unquote, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps or being more self-reliant, to me is a fairly offensive view. And I would imagine most of the chiefs down at the meeting with Prime Minister Harper today, who are here in the best interest of all of their communities, would find Mr. Haleen's characterization of them as so-called old Indian Act chiefs extremely offensive, if not defamatory.
Well, Mr. Haleen's not here to defend himself, so but I'll push back a little bit with you on this. Aren't there a lot of people within the Native community and observers from outside who say that the Indian Act does need to be ended, or some aspects of it need to be ended, because it involves, essentially this codependency where the federal government meddles tremendously with the Native communities so that they don't have enough autonomy, but at the same time, they don't really have responsibility for their own actions, neither autonomy nor responsibility.
I'll respond to that. I mean, the one thing I did agree with Mr. Haleen about is the fact that Prime Minister Harper presides over one of the most backward, corrupt, and incompetent bureaucracies in the history of the planet, and that's specifically the Department of Indian Affairs. So, abolish the Department of Indian Affairs and take all of the money that's going into those incompetent bureaucrats and put it directly into the hands of people at the First Nations level with adequate accounting and safeguards and those types of things. And I think you're a long way, towards a more appropriate solution. But let's not forget for a minute that this whole idea of abolishing the Indian Act goes back to the Trudeau White Paper of 1968, and the idea that won't resource development in Canada be so much easier if we just get rid of all of these pesky Indians and their treaty and Aboriginal rights and the reserves in the middle of resource development country where people are living on the land and continue to hunt and fish and carry on traditional lifestyles, which are largely inconvenient to the goals of industry of destroying the environment and destroying traditional lands. So really, that's what this is about. It's a tension between Aboriginal communities that have a right to resources within their territories coming up against Canadian big business that finds the existence of reserves and finds the existence of First Nations people in the midst of resource wealth to be extremely inconvenient. I mean, it's a tension that dates back to the start of Confederation.
But the voice coming out of the First Nations is not one unified voice. So how do you address the fragmented voice within the First Nations, and what does reform look like in your mind given those fundamentals?
I don't think that the voice is as fragmented as people like Mr. Helene would like people to believe. I believe that First Nations people in the country are united around a very simple concept, which is it's an absolute national embarrassment and a crime of epic proportion that First Nations people live in abject poverty without safe drinking water and in the conditions that they live in the midst of all of the wealth of this country that's built on their backs, taken out of their lands. I mean, Mr. Helene talks about Canadian democracy from a united First Nations perspective. This is a Canadian kleptocracy that's built on the theft of First Nations resources in contravention to international law and international conventions. So, I understand that Mr. Helene has a vested interest in seeing resources develop, and he sees other First Nations having rights to territories that he wants to develop in, as being in the way and being an inconvenience to this development. But the reality of it is that there needs to be a dialogue. The Government of Canada needs to recognize that First Nations have a role to play in resource development. And one of the first and most important steps in getting First Nations to participate in resource development in Canada is to pay them what they're owed in the billions of dollars in trusts and endowments so that they can invest in these businesses and invest in resource development in their territory. It's all well and good to say, First Nations should participate in the economy. Well, as we all know, this is a capitalist society, and it takes capital to do it. So wouldn't it be preferable for First Nations to have a multi-billion-dollar endowment, or each First Nation to have several hundred million in trust that it could lever, on the equity markets or through financial institutions, merchant banking and lending, so that they could actually invest in pipeline construction and invest in oil and gas developments, invest in mining developments if they wanted to do that. That's what this whole abolish the Indian Act, get rid of the Indian reserves, let's not have Indians have a tax exemption movement, that Mr. Helene represents, seems to forget. You don't tell people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps while at the same time stealing their boots. I mean, enough is enough.
All right, Jeffrey, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Our guest has been Jeffrey Rath, barrister and solicitor at Rath & Company.